Now, what does a conversation mean? So the erotic cosmos, or what I would call the cosmo-erotic universe, or the amorous cosmos, the cosmos of amor, or what we might call the universe colon a love story, or we might call the intimate universe. Those are all different ways that we in cosmoerotic humanism try and describe reality. And all of them, at their very core, are descriptions of the conversational cosmos. So we have friends. We have been together for the last, some people started at 5 a.m. this morning in California. We started at 8 Vermont time. And we've been kind of deep in this conversation. And I made a promise, and the promise will be kept, that we would, for the sake of the evolution of consciousness and culture, we would really engage these texts of culture that we've looked at in One Mountain for 4 weeks running, which are texts that are articulated by a kind of populist voice of culture, a populist historian, Yuval Harari. And I've already talked about, we're honoring Yuval, and we're holding him tenderly and fiercely. And I've talked about that before. But the nature of these texts and their chilling effect on culture and their incapacitating our ability to respond to the immense potentiality of imminent suffering is so significant that we wanted to just really engage it text by text, and to actually look very carefully and have time to really unfold. And so I tried to lay out, in a few minutes, just like 10 major topics that need to be kind of talked about, right, in engaging these texts. And we got through this morning, we went for about, 4.5 hours, and we got through 2 of them. And we did a quite intense 4.5 hour ride. And so what I'd like to do in One Mountain is to do one topic that is related to that flow. So those of you who are with us in the morning can kind of stay in that vector, which is incredibly important. We're going to finish hopefully on time today, close to on time. And then we'll take a, 5-minute break. And then I know you guys are all tired and, suffering the infirmities of age and, stamina and all those kind of things. But we're going full on this afternoon. And I know for some of you, that's going to be an insanely long day. If there's no one left standing at the end, and I'm just here with, one person, we're good. But we need to get this down. We need to articulate this. And for me, I'm spending, 12 hours on a Sunday, right, trying to articulate this clearly, because it matters unbelievably much. Yeah, so we did a lot of new material this morning, and approached old material kind of in a new way. And so it's really just an incredibly important morning. And if you feel like I'm starting a little slowly, it is because I am slightly exhausted from the morning. So it's going to kind of take a second to kind of find this new path in. Thank you, Taylor, for a beautiful Dharma recapitulation, and David for helping us get the code down. And James is going to articulate the code. Jamie, give us the code and we're going to step in. Okay, we got a huge 45 minutes. Give us the code and we're going to step in. Okay, here we go. Jamie, take us inside.
My name is Jamie, and today is my delight to resonate today's evolutionary love code about our topic of trust and conversation. There is no Eros without trust. There is no trust without conversation. There is no conversation without each contributing a verse. There is no verse without a shared text of inherent value. And I'll repeat the code. There is no Eros without trust. There's no trust without conversation. There is no conversation without each contributing a verse. There is no verse without a shared text of inherent value. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. All right, here we go. So let's see if we can find this. Conversation, right? Who's been in conversations recently, right? Conversation. Okay, that's our topic. And for those of you who were with us this morning, we're going to recapitulate a couple of the themes. We're gonna recontextualize it. For those of you who weren't with us this morning, we missed you, right? And we're gonna try and crystallize form, right? Try and see if we can find our way here. Intimacy, the intimate universe, is about a set of conversations. Does that make sense? The intimate universe is a conversational cosmos. It's a term that Howard Bloom has used, and that I've used, that David White's used, a number of other people. Howard uses it most originally, right, in a scientific context. And I think originally probably coins the term. It's a great term. There's a conversational cosmos. And as Howard and I have talked, the meaning of the term is, I think, changed for Howard. Right? That's what real conversation does. And in real conversation, we inherit new meaning. We inhabit new possibility. We inhabit new value. And Howard Bloom, have been having conversations for the last 7 or 8 years. And that's our topic, conversation. So one day, Barb Marks Hubbard, who co-founded the Evolutionary Church with me, was my great delight and honor. One mountain, many paths, as we call it together, as a kind of seat of the revolution, right? The revolution against, right, a kind of empire hidden in the structures of a systemic society that optimizes for collapse, that optimizes for the failure of intimacy, that optimizes for the breakdown of trust at the core of society, that optimizes for a global intimacy disorder, which, as we're going to see this morning, is the root cause for the meta crisis and for existential risk. And that's what One Mountain's about. One Mountain is about evolving the source code of consciousness and culture, generating the possibility of the emergence of a new human and a new humanity, telling a new story of value, because it's only a new story of value that can actually reboot reality, that can actually evolve the source code itself. Nothing else can do that. All the infrastructure moves we make, as important as they are, won't get us home. All the social structure moves we make, all the regulation won't get us home. We actually need to change the conversation in which we live. And conversations always live someplace. Conversations always take place within structures of consciousness. Conversations always take place within a field. There's always a context for conversation. And the context for conversation is everything. And so I want to tell you a little story about conversation and about the conversational cosmos. Let's have a conversation about it, and let's evolve conversation itself. We're gonna engage together in an evolution of conversation, and we're going to be responding directly to my friend and colleague Yuval Harari, whose chilling of culture takes place in large measure through his upgrading of algorithms and downgrading of conversation. There's a fundamental downgrading of what conversation means at its very core. But first, let me just tell you a story about conversation. So Barbara calls me, Barbara Marks Hubbard, and Barbara and I in the last, I don't know, 5 years of her life probably had 5 conversations a day, 5 communications a day of different forms, either audible, audio, or written, or text. And Barbara says, I have this incredibly good idea. Now, I don't know how many people remember getting a phone call from Barbara, but Barbara had this very stunning capacity to get excited every day, which is stunning. And it's not because she was naturally ebullient, right, or just so vivacious. It's because she actually was willing to move through the darkness. She often encountered intense loneliness. She died at 89. She passed at 89. Most of her friends, and I met her, we had our first kind of deep meeting when she was 83. How about that, right? And most of her close friends had passed. I remember talking to Werner Erhard at a moment when Werner and I were engaged in a multi-hour, very long, beautiful conversation. And I mentioned Barbara, and he said, wow, Barbara's still with us, from the old days. So Barbara said to me that most of her friends, most of her conversational partners, right, had passed. And she was lonely. There was no one to have a conversation with. And I want to talk a bit deeply about what that means. And so she called and said, oh, I've got this incredibly exciting idea. And as I said, she maintained her ebullience by walking through the loneliness and a commitment to walk through the loneliness every day. Right? Every day she encountered, this sense of emptiness, the sense of, wow, have I lived too long? Right? Am I the remnant? Right? After my people have passed. Right? What am I here? Should I be hanging up my cleats, or is there something left for me to do? Is there another conversation, right, that I still need to be having? And she called me and she said, it just occurred to me that you and Howard Bloom need to be in conversation. I said, wow, Howard Bloom. Who's Howard? Oh, right. Howard wrote the Lucifer Principle. I said, how do you know Howard? So she told me a conversation about how she knew Howard. And she called Howard, she called me. We both were reluctant, but Barbara, of course, in her ineluctable fashion, persuaded us. And so we joined the conversation, and the conversation has gone on every other week for 7 or 8 years now. Barbara, of course, participated until she passed in the early conversations. And Howard and I continued and have developed, Howard is a scholar at the think tank, and he also runs independently the Howard Bloom Institute, and is one of really the great thinker, mind, wild, creative expressions of new cosmic possibility. My dear friend Ken Wilber said to me about Howard, which I shared with Howard. He said, reading Howard is like getting postcards from the edge, right? Postcards from the edge. And Howard and I have had, do the math, many conversations. And in those conversations, we have each deepened. We've each become more. There's been new possibility. There's been new opening. And one of the conversations we've had is about the conversational cosmos, what we mean by that. And both of us have shifted our understanding and come to a larger shared understanding of this term, originally from Howard, right, of conversational cosmos, what a conversational cosmos means. But we mean it quite seriously, both of us, right? We mean it quite seriously, and it'll be the core of some shared writing that we do, right, about the conversational cosmos. It's a conversational cosmos all the way down and all the way up the evolutionary chain. Does that make sense? Now, in the lineage conversation always means two things. Conversation means eros, sensuality, sexuality, but first eros. And remember, there's 12 billion years of eros before there's any sex, right? So eros means the movement of reality. And that movement of reality is a conversational movement. Now, bracket. Here's where we're going. We're going to go through a number of steps until we get to a point where I'm actually going to turn to my friend Yuval and show you how he talks about conversation and why that way of talking about conversation destroys conversation and is part of the root cause for suffering, the potential suffering of catastrophic risk, the present suffering, and the potential future suffering of existential risk, risk to our very existence, the death of humanity, and a second form of existential risk, the potential death of our humanity. So let's step in. So in the lineage of Solomon in the interior sciences, and Solomon is the guy who's having a lot of conversations. Solomon marries 1,000 wives. That's a lot of conversation. Does that ever occur to you? So the 1,000 wives that Solomon marries are in the lineage. They're about 1,000 conversations. That's actually what they're about. It's Solomon's Shekhinah project. Shekhinah means the face of the divine, which is Eros, the Eros that suffuses reality. So Solomon wants to have 1,000 conversations, and he marries 1,000 women from different traditions, from different lineages, from different nations, and he refuses to treat them only as other and as enemy. And he says, okay, we got to find each other. We got to have a conversation. And he often builds temples in Jerusalem for his wives that are out of the precincts of his own temple, of Solomon's temple. So Solomon's about having the conversation in some kind of deep and profound way. Does that make sense? So Solomon's 1,000 wives are Solomon's 1,000 conversations. Now, what does a conversation mean? So the erotic cosmos, or what I would call the cosmo-erotic universe, or the amorous cosmos, the cosmos of amor, or what we might call the universe colon a love story, or we might call the intimate universe. Those are all different ways that we in cosmoerotic humanism try and describe reality. And all of them, at their very core, are descriptions of the conversational cosmos. So conversational cosmos means that different parts engage in conflict in the sense of conscious contradiction, conscious conflict, conscious debate, each one taking their perspective, rooted in their potency and rooted in their poignancy and rooted in their unique quality of power. And out of that conversation between the parts emerges a new wholeness. Now, what wholeness means, wholeness is the quality of Eros. Right? Eros equals the experience of radical aliveness, desiring ever deeper contact. Contact is conversation. Contact between the parts. Eros is the experience of radical aliveness, right? The aliveness that comes from great conversation. There's nothing like great conversation. I'm on the inside of the inside, right? 7 hours have gone by, right? It feels like 5 minutes. But I'm in the living universe. I'm in the living cosmos because I'm on the inside of conversation. And from the contradiction has emerged a new wholeness. Eros and the Eros equation in the interior sciences of cosmoerotic humanism, which is the new story of value that we're articulating in response to the meta crisis, Eros equals the experience of radical aliveness, desiring deeper contact, read conversation, and ever greater wholeness. And wholeness is that which emerges from conversation. Now, the Hebrew word for wholeness is shalom, wholeness, which means peace. So I make peace out of conflict. Peace doesn't bypass conflict. Peace moves through conflict. And it's only the capacity to engage in conflict in a way that generates new potency and new potentiality, that potentiates new possibility instead of polarizes, that allows us to respond to individual suffering, personal suffering, to collective suffering, to catastrophic risk, to existential risk, right? To the fundamental destruction of our life world, politically, economically, socially, and in terms of the very tectonic plates of reality. So let's see if we can find this. So what does conversation mean? Conversation means no part is apart. Does that make sense? No part's apart. You know, in the original Hebrew, the word for conflict is machloket, M-A-C-H-L-O-K-E-T, machloket. Machloket comes from the root word, machloket comes from the root word chelek. Chelek means part. Does that make sense? Chelek means part. And part means parts that partition, right, that separate, and that don't yet know that they mutually participate, notice the play of language, in a larger whole. And when parts mutually participate in each other's experience, and they actually see their relationship to the larger whole, and they hold the irreducible uniqueness of their perspective, of their part, of their position, then they generate something new in cosmos. They generate new wholeness. They generate new intimacy. It's why the word conversation means both kind of sensuality and sexing, because out of sexing, out of sensuality, and out of the original Eros, which is sexing before there's any sex for 12 billion years, and sexing in all the non-sexual worlds after there's sex, meaning it's all the dimensions of reality in which these two parts come together, and instead of destroying each other, they create something new. They create new possibility. They create new wholeness. That's the movement of Eros itself, right? All through cosmos. So when conversation breaks down, evolution stops. That's what actually evolution is. Evolution is actually a series of conversations. So in other words, I mean, it's so profound. It's so beautiful. In other words, reality is a series of conversations. Does that make sense? You could talk about reality in one of two ways, or you could talk about evolutionary reality in one of two ways. You could say reality is a series of conversations, or you could say reality is a series of transformations. You could say evolution is a series of conversations, or evolution is a series of transformations. But actually, it's the same thing, because the nature of conversation that's authentic is that it leads to transformation. Does that make sense? Okay. The second meaning of the word conversation is Messiah, Mashiach. Messiah, the English word of the Hebrew phrase Mashiach, Masiach. Siach literally means conversation. Masiach, what's your conversation? Let's have a conversation. I come to the conversation with a question, with the quest I'm on, and I'm willing to engage with you in conversation. I'm open to be transformed without giving up my core integrity, without giving up my core depth, without giving up my core direction. And then my direction meets your direction. My depth meets your depth. My integrity meets your integrity. And if we're both together in the field of value, and we actually understand that we are individuations of the field of value, we're not separate selves. We're not materialistic chance expressions of a random cosmos, which is just bad science. We're actually at the leading edges of science, irreducibly unique expressions of the field of Eros value, we each actually have a verse to contribute, precisely the opposite of Harari's contention, that actually any meaning that anyone ascribes to their life is mere delusion. And the word delusion, look it up in the dictionary, means against objective reality, or quote in the dictionary Webster's, against the incontrovertible evidence of objective reality, right? The expression of mental breakdown is what the dictionary says. No. So Harari says, no, any sense that you have a part to play, you have a verse to contribute, is, right, Sapiens, the chapter on happiness, somewhere around 391, right, is delusion. The delusional. That's the phrase that he uses all through, right, his literature. No. That's actually a mistake. That's actually a dogmatic, scientistic materialism, right, that actually misunderstands the nature of reality and makes dogmatic claims about it against mounds of empirical evidence. And part of that empirical evidence is the realization that reality is a conversational cosmos, and there's conversations about value, and there's conversations between values, and there's conversations about meaning all the way down the evolutionary chain. In other words, the codes of reality, from the mathematical codes, the mathematical values, till the musical values, right, until the molecular values, are all coded with specific value, specific qualities of allurement towards specific values, towards specific fields of meaning, and then meanings come together and larger meaning is created. Value comes together, values come together, and from the fructification, the dialectic between values, new value is created. So I'm pro-life. I'm glad you're pro-life. That's great. No, I'm pro-choice. I'm glad you're pro-choice. That's great. But well, 1 second, I'm pro-life. There can't be any choice. It's about life. Life's the value. No, I'm pro-choice. Choice is the value. It's not about life. It's about choice. Those are both obviously wrong. What's actually true is that both life and choice are innate, intrinsic, inherent values in the field of value. But before life is life and before choice is choice, life is value and choice is value. So therefore, from the synergistic, erotic dance, the sensual undulation of life and choice as they meet and engage, let's go back 50 years in a tango or in a wild rave somewhere in the Nevada desert, what happens is from their autonomy and from their unique vectors of value, in which they each validate each other because they're each expressions of the field of value, they then synergize and create a new whole. A new whole. A new whole means new value. A new whole means new possibility. A new whole is the shalom, the peace that surpasseth all understanding, that emerges from conflict. But from conflict that's in the field of value, which is the field of consciousness, which means that the vectors of value never seek total victory. They always and only seek partial victory. And partial victory means I've been transformed by you. Wow. Wow, that's conversation. That's the crazy joy of conversation. The realization that these two parts can actually generate a larger whole. That's erotic conversation. You can't pay for erotic conversation. No amount of money, no credit card will buy you a real erotic conversation. A real erotic conversation means I'm radically rooted in the depth of my I-ness, but my I-ness, my ani, my A-N-I, the original Hebrew for I, is rooted in those same 3 letters, slightly spelled differently, ayin, and ayin means the field of no thingness, which is the field of inherent value. Since we're both in the field of inherent value, as we meet, as our verses meet, they create a new sacred text. They create a new quality of intimacy. And if we actually understand, it's so deep and beautiful that God's not only the infinity of power, but the infinity of intimacy. And that the new name of God, as we've called it together in cosmorotic humanism of this new story of value, the new name of God is the infinite intimate. So God is infinity garbed in the intimate. The infinite, God is the infinite intimate. And I am God's unique intimacy. That's me. I'm God's unique intimacy, which means I'm God's unique verse. Isn't that beautiful? One master said, we are each unique letters in the cosmic scroll. Zushi of Anipal said that in the 19th century. I wouldn't name your kid that. Right? Right? We're each unique letters in the cosmic scroll. We're each unique verses. In reality, that's not merely a fact, but an unfolding story describing the progressive deepening of intimacies. And intimacy means, not into me, you see, slay me if anyone says that. Okay, intimacy means we come together from the place of our otherness, and we realize we're living in a shared field of value. We each incarnate a unique configuration of desire and value. Those values meet and a larger whole is created. That's peace. That's where peace comes from. Huh? Yeah, right? That's wild. That's wild. So I'm going to ask everyone to take a minute and think about a conversation. I'm going to open the chat box and think about a conversation that you refuse to have. Okay, just want to think about that for a second. Think about a conversation that you refuse to have. I'm gonna turn off the camera. I'm gonna ask everyone to hold silence of presence. So we're gonna take literally 2 minutes. I'm gonna ask everyone in these 2 minutes, just jot into the chat box, this is a conversation I've refused to have. Right? And it's gotta be one we're gonna open up to have the possibility of having. What are the conversations we've refused to have with ourselves, with others? Who have we placed outside of the conversation? We've said they have no daemon. They have no unique incarnation of meaning. They're only demon. We demonize when there's no daemon. So take a second. We're going to go 2 minutes, 1:45, exactly 2 minutes. And we're going to access what are the conversations we refuse to have. And I'll read a couple. Let's take a look at the conversations we refuse to have. Conversation you refuse to have, right? Honest communication with myself about my health and physical needs, right? The conversation with ethnocentric shadows in all their forms. Giving up conversing with my postmodern brother, with my husband about money. I refuse to have a conversation with my Uncle Kenny. I don't have a conversation with a specific person. I don't want to talk to that person ever again. I'm done. With my friend about her addiction. Right? A person be allowed to choose the time and manner of his death. Right? Refuse to have a conversation with the coffee shop I abandoned, right? You begin to feel like the conversations we refuse to have. Right? And those conversations we refuse to have, some of them, right? Right? About a whole nother level of relationship, says Terry. Right? Some of those conversations maybe aren't ready. And every conversation has its temple, right? We're not in an EST seminar in the mid-70s before Werner got a little more refined, and we kind of force every conversation all the time, right? Every conversation has its temple. But we always need to, why do I refuse to have the conversation? Is it because that person's impossible or that topic's impossible and they're fundamentally wrong? But if they were different, then the conversation was possible. Or is there a part of me that I don't know how to bring to the conversation? Because I can't bring that part of me to the conversation. I don't know how to evoke from them something that they would need to show up with in order for that conversation to be possible. The global intimacy disorder, which is the root cause of the meta crisis, is at its very core a conversational disorder. An inability to have a conversation. Now, I want to track this for a second. I'm going to get to my friend Yuval, but I want to track this. So one, we talk about this global intimacy disorder. So one, the global intimacy disorder is the structure of reality that's governed by rivalrous conflict, which is always win-lose metrics. And when I'm in rivalrous conflict with you, We're each actually optimizing for the efficiency of our success story, and we're sub-optimizing for contact. We're sub-optimizing for intimacy. We're sub-optimizing for wholeness. We're sub-optimizing for integrity. Right? Then we have an intimacy disorder. We're not actually having a conversation. We might be exchanging. We might be looking at each other. We might be looking in each other's eyes, but we're not actually having a conversation. It's not happening. It doesn't happen. That's one. Two, when you have a society that's optimized for non-conversation, because it's actually a success conversation always, which means you're always an instrument for my furtherance, even though we seem to be having a conversation, it's a pseudo conversation. What that does is that generates not coherent complex systems, David Snowden's term, or what Nassim Taleb calls anti-fragile systems, systems that are actually resilient, that can survive shocks, that can actually have a kind of long-term sense of continuity. We don't have those are called complex systems. We actually have complicated systems, and complicated system means fragile systems. And the demarcating characteristic of fragile systems is that, ready for this? There's no conversation between the parts. So I often say, a financial instrument is created in the Far East that ripples through the European financial markets and crashes into America and causes a mortgage meltdown in 2008, which is a rough approximation of some dimension of some of the vectors that happened then in that financial meltdown. But the point is that there's not a conversation between the different dimensions of society, right? The different forces acting are all acting in their very narrow local vector, and there's no sense of the whole. So there's an alienation from the whole. There's no whole conversation. We're not whole mates with each other, right? There's an alienation or a dissociation from the whole. So everyone's involved by definition in a local conversation and actually creating sets of effects that ripple through the system, but there's no intimacy between the different parts of the system because they're not actually in conversation. They're not hearing each other. They're actually tone deaf to each other. They're barely even or at all that each other even exist. And you can't have a conversation with a dimension of reality that you don't know exists. 3, there's alienation between different forms of knowing. So is it the knowing of the sciences, the eye of the senses, or the eye of the mind? Is it the knowing of the heart, the eye of the heart? Is it knowing of value, the eye of value? Is the knowing of contemplation, the eye of contemplation? Is it the knowing of ritual, the eye of the spirit? So just notice, there's different ways of knowing. Just talk about science and humanities. It's just a narrow expression of these different ways of knowing. They don't talk to each other. There's no conversation between the science and the humanities of any real kind. There's no conversation between the eye of the heart and the eye of the empirical measured senses. The senses that measure and the senses that sense the heart don't talk to each other. One's called merely subjective, and the other engages in what it calls the real, the objective, or the subjective says only I count. It's only the feeling tone that counts, and the objective be damned. There's no conversation between ways of knowing. Number 3. Number 4, there's no conversation across time. The past is the past, the present, the future, the future, but there needs to be a conversation between past, present, and future. There needs to be a conversation between the generations. That's a conversational cosmos. Otherwise, we have alienation, which is the opposite of conversation. Number 4. Number 5, we're alienated from sense making. Right? We're alienated from sense making. We don't know how to do sense making. Right? The world has become, from our perspective, too complicated. There's too many variables. Most people have no idea how to even explain fractional reserve banking. What's that? What's fractional reserve banking? What's driving the growth curve in the world? I don't even know. I don't even know what you mean by a growth curve. Right? Right? We have no idea how our own financial systems, which are the currents of energy, right, personified by money, actually work in our world. We're actually completely alienated from sense making, from actually making sense about the most immediate dimensions of reality in which we're embedded. because the world's gotten sufficiently complicated that the effort of sense making just seems too hard for lots of people. It's all seems kind of obfuscated and unclear. Okay, wow. Right, it's number 5. Number 6, we're alienated from conversation with our different selves. So I've got a separate self. We've talked about, right, the skin encapsulated ego, and the separate self is real in the mind of God, my personality. We've got true self, my participation in the field. I'm inseparable from the field of consciousness and desire and eros and value. I'm one with the field. My unique self, I'm an irreducibly unique expression of the field. My evolutionary unique self, the evolutionary impulse that pulses in me uniquely, that's 4 selves right there. Let's just add one more. My pre-personal self that doesn't even want to be a unique self, just wants to merge with the all, whatever the all happens to be. It might be hashish, and it might be a cult, and it might be a relationship in which I fuse and don't engage in union, but I just want to go pre-personal. We'll call that my pre-personal kind of anti-self. So all 5 of those selves are not talking to each other. I'm not talking to all of them, and they're not talking to each other. Huh. Wow. Right. And in some deep sense, we might call that, right, this alienation within the self, right? This intimacy disorder within the self, this breakdown of conversation within the self. You know, my friend Richard Schwartz, started something called internal family systems, right? And Dick, you know, kind of works within the vector of part theory, right? Or subpersonalities or voice dialogue. Helen Sidra Stone did, they called it voice dialogue. There's a lot of different ways to tell the story. It emerges in California, actually in the kind of early 90s, but it's got roots that are much deeper. And it's about the different selves. I've got a controller. I've got a protector. I've got a wounded child. I've got a seeking mind, right? There's all these different selves, but I'm not in conversation with all of the selves. That's one. So myself, my larger whole, my wholeness is not in conversation with all of the selves. Then the selves, number 7, are not in conversation with each other. As the protector is not talking to the controller. The wounded child is not talking to the seeking mind. So there's a failure of conversation within the self, within all the multiple selves. Number 7. Number 8, right? There's no conversation between us because we don't experience ourselves as participating in a shared story. We don't have a shared story. We don't feel ourselves as being part of shared plot lines. So we can go to a movie and we can get excited to go to a movie together because we're actually participating in an empathetic catharsis with someone else's plot lines. But between us, we don't feel the shared plot lines of our story. We're not in a shared story. So there's no conversation between us because we can only have a conversation if we're in a shared story, which creates polarization. And polarization is the experience that we're not in a shared field of value, true self. We're not in a shared field of value. So therefore, we hijack one value. We decontextualize that value from a conversation with the larger whole, and we make that one value autistic. It becomes an autistic value which seeks to dominate the field of value, which becomes radically aggressive. It becomes the eye of Sauron. The eye of Sauron disqualifies all the other eyes and makes this aggressive, dominating move an autistic move, right? It becomes a cancerous cell that's dissociated from the larger field of life and seeks to multiply itself to listen to its own self-conversation, which is actually just a monologue. It's not a conversation. It's an autistic monologue, which actually destroys the entire communion and then suicides the autistic monologue or him or herself. Right? That's what cancer means. Cancer means the same thing as polarization, right? It's no conversation, right? It's this set of cells, right, that metastasize against all the other cells, right? Number 10, we're alienated from the field of value itself. We don't realize that we're in a field of value and that all of matter and all of energy arises within a field of value. So we're alienated from a conversation with the field of value, which is a conversation with the recesses and depths of self because we participate, are part participates in the larger whole, and the larger whole is the field of value, but we're alienated from the field of value. We're dissociated. There's no conversation with the field. Number 11, there's no conversation between values. So we talked about earlier, life doesn't have a conversation with choice, right? Security doesn't have a conversation with peace. Communion doesn't have a conversation with autonomy. Certainty doesn't have a conversation with uncertainty. Audacity doesn't have a conversation with humility. You begin to understand? There's no conversation between the values, so there's no larger wholeness that emerges. 12, right? We actually act in the world and we disintimate with the externalities of our action. We run a factory, but there's a whole set of externalities that affect the rest of the system. We don't have a conversation with those externalities. We actually arbitrarily say, okay, this is a medicine, it's a pharmacological medicine. Oh, externality, it causes 13 side effects. Nope, those are just side effects, write them on the side. Those are just side effects. That's not really what we're doing. What we're really doing is our purposeful action. Externalities, nothing. We don't have a conversation with externalities. Legally, let's say in the pharmacological instance, we're obligated to write them on the side of the box. But in most of industry, we don't even need to write them on the side of the box. We're just not in conversation with them. Does that make sense? We've taken them out of the conversation. That's 12. 13. There's no conversation between classes, between the elite and the masses, between the 1% and the 99%. Right? There's not a sense where I can actually feel what it means not to be able to figure out, will I have enough food this week? Will I have enough food this month? How will I balance my checkbook this month? I know quite a lot of people, even though they don't talk to me about it, and I'm aware of, right, when people are having a hard time balancing the checkbook, that's a very big deal. And we can't actually feel it. We can't feel another person's poverty. We can't feel another person's impoverishment, right? Or their own experience of alienation, whether it's financial or otherwise. So there's a fundamental alienation between the elite and the masses. And then finally, there's actually a fundamental inability to have a conversation with myself, because my inward space of meaning, right, has been violated by an entire immersive environment that I live inside, which is optimized for the hijacking of attention. And attention, right, is the prerequisite for the potency of conversation. It means I'm paying attention. That's what love is. Love is the placing of attention. Eros is the placing of attention. Sex is the placing of attention. Sexual potency is based on one thing, the radical placing of attention. Because that's why sex is a conversation at its core. It's one expression of the conversational cosmos. Wow. That's the global intimacy disorder, right? It's a conversational disorder. But the root of every conversation is trust. And trust happens, and that's the first alienation we have to overcome. And when we overcome that alienation, we're in the conversation. And all conversations flow from it, which is what? The alienation from the field of value. As long as I'm outside of the field of value, conversation is too much of an effort. Conversation somehow in the way of my short-term goals, which I seek, right, to deaden the emptiness and the ennui of the emptiness of being fundamentally emptied of Eros value. I can't bear the emptiness. I can't bear the ennui. I seek to cover it up. I cover it up with pseudo-Eros. And pseudo-Eros is, by its nature, the inhibitor of conversation. Pseudo-Eros inhibits conversation, addiction, acting out, right? Violence, abuse, manipulation. But those are all inhibitors of the core movement of cosmos. The core movement of cosmos is the currency of conversation. So the first conversation to have is with myself, with the part of myself that participates in the field of value. So I begin to have a conversation with myself. I begin to trust my inner knowing. And I know that the deeper my relationship is to my field of inner knowing, not what I know necessarily immediately, there's some of it's common sense. Got to take my common sense seriously, but not all of it's common sense. Some interior knowing comes from common sense. That's one form of interior knowing. So there's the knowing, the conversation with common sense, but there's another conversation with contemplation. I've got to go deeper. I've got to enter the mystery, right? Meditatively, contemplation. And finally, there's what we call transfiguration, right? I engage so deeply in the potency of practice that I actually transfigure. I become more than I ever possibly thought I could be. And I begin to converse with parts of myself that were long split off. And I realize that I'm actually dazzling, beautiful, inseparable from the currency of cosmos, right? That I am actually God's verb, that I am actually God's conversation, that I am God's verse, that I have a verse to contribute, right? Wow. I'm in the conversation. I'm at the table. I'm at the conversation. Totalitarianism, whether it's the totalitarianism of self-tyranny, when I can't shatter the tyranny of the ego's dream, or whether it's the totalitarianism of the polis, right? Or about shutting the conversation down, but being afraid to have the conversation because I'm afraid that the surveillance will disclose something that will make me vulnerable, right, to the success story of my superficial self, right? To actually liberate myself from the shackles of tyranny, I need to be willing to have all the conversations. Not every place and not every time, right? Every truth has its temple. Every truth is the emergence of a conversation. It's a conversational cosmos. Democracy is the ability to have a genuine conversation across the polis. It's to move beyond polarization. It's the willingness, democracy in relationship in the world of the personal, right? Or I wouldn't call it democracy, I would call it depth. In the world of the personal is the willingness to have the impossible conversation, even if we can't resolve it. To have the potency of actually hearing your pathos, right? Even if, right, it causes me pain. I honor your pain and you honor my pain. And together we create new potency. We've got to be willing to not go tone deaf, right? To stay in the conversation, not to say that every perspective is equal. Sometimes there's a hierarchy of perspectives. Sometimes I might be very sure that I'm right and I might be right and you might be dead wrong. And that might dictate a certain kind of conversation, but even that still dictates a conversation. There's always a conversation to be had. And the conversation always deepens us. Yuval makes the devastating claim that democracy requires conversation and conversation requires infotech for us to be proximate to each other, to be able to technically, functionally talk to each other. That's not correct. To have a conversation, we need to trust each other. To trust each other, we need to be in the field of value together. That's what conversation means. We trust there's a shared verse. We trust there's a shared text. We trust there's a shared musical score between us. So even if we're each playing our unique self-instrument, which is our unique verse that we contribute, which is our unique incarnation of intimacy, our unique configuration of desire, our deepest heart's desire, our deepest unique heart's desire, which is God's desire awake and alive in us, we can actually hear each other because we're in a shared conversation, because we're in a field of value together, right? To suggest that we can have a conversation, that we need to have a conversation, that democracy collapses, that existential risk triumphs when we can't have a conversation. And then to basically say, but value's not real, meaning is not real. Any meaning that a human being gives their life is mere delusion. Meaning and value, which are page 170, Homo Deus, Harari, are the same in his language, are complete contrived, utterly fiction, are delusion, meaning mental breakdowns that go against the incontrovertible evidence, right, that's available to us. Right? To make that argument and then to suggest that we should have conversation is absurd. That is actually the recipe for the totalitarian. And that's what we talked about this morning. What I said this morning is, and I tried to recapitulate one dimension of what we said this morning, right? When I basically say that value is not real, number one, I say value is not real. Number two, I say we need a conversation in order to survive. Number three, I say we need to have a shared story in order to survive. Number four, I say we need a shared story of value in order to survive that actually people actually agree on and can coordinate based on that shared story of value. Number five. But number six, I say value is not real. It's completely fictive. The number seven, what I'm saying is somebody's got to make up a story of value and impose it through propaganda, subliminal and direct, on the population. That's what I'm saying. That was the point of everything we said this morning. And that's why I did this conclusion, which hopefully stood by itself. So if you weren't with us this morning, you were good. But at the same time, if you were, you kind of get, if you say the field of value is not real, and you say a story of value is utterly necessary in order to cohere, right, in the face of existential risk, but value is not real, and as from Yuval's perspective, flawed and limited and kind of superficial as it is in this particular case, story is not real and value is not real, and stories of value are not real. A, but B, we can't survive without a coordinating story of value. Then C, we have some version of either Orwellian or Skinnerian totalitarianism. It's either the Ministry of Love in Orwell's 1984, or it's Skinner's Walden 2, which are both forms of totalitarianism, one ostensibly benign, Walden 2, the other more brutal, Orwellian, but they're both totalitarian because they're both saying we create value, we create the story of value, and we either subliminally, right, through levers of what are called invisible control, levers adopted by the MIT Media Lab, founded by Alex Pentland, right, who bases himself directly on Skinnerian principles, right? What are we going to do? We're going to actually upend the conversation without anyone knowing that it happened. Right? We're going to control a person's internal conversation, right? They're not even going to know what hit them. We can actually, right, undermine, subvert, or bypass free will. We can actually cause conversation through sequenced provocations. We can actually create, right, completely statistically legitimate predictive capacity, which we sell, Google says, as our major product. That's our business model, not a search engine. Facebook, our business model is selling predictive capacity, not connecting people. We're connecting people in order to create addiction, right? Constant engagement, in order to gather data from the digital exhaust, in order to create personality profiles in peer groups that allow for predictive analysis, meaning we've upended the conversation. There's no more real conversation. That's what digital dictatorship does. It shuts down the conversation. So, wow, what do we need to do? We need to re-engage the conversation. We need to re-engage the wholeness, the synergy that comes. We human beings are the apex at this moment of time of the conversational cosmos. And we need to be talking to the animal community. We need to be talking to all the species that we're extincting. We need to be talking to the split off parts of ourselves. It's all about conversation. It's a conversational cosmos. But most critically, we need to realize and experience ourselves in the Tao, in the field of value. And from that place, we move from polarization to new possibility. We need move from polarization to the possibility that the promise of humanity can be kept. So, wow. The alternative is totalitarian. And totalitarian either means the death of our humanity, or possibly becomes an artificial intelligence, artificial general intelligence totalitarianism that imposes a values lockdown, as it's been correctly described in the literature of existential risk, and actually hijacks the systems. And we all operate within that immersive environment, and we can't actually in any way step out of it. The conversation has to take place. So I need to talk to Yuval, and Yuval needs to talk to me. We need to talk to each other. We need to create a shared field of value and a shared field of possibility. And so I've engaged these past weeks in a kind of, sharply critical, fiercely critical to measure an understatement, right, of Yuval's positions, while madly defending to the death his right to have them, in order to actually have a real conversation. And I invite you all to that conversation anytime, any place. Let's have it in public or in private. And let's actually move this forward. Let's actually find a synergy. Let's find the best underlying intuitions that you have, right, that I've expressed, and let's create something new. Like, that's what we need to do. We need a shared story. We need a shared story of value. We need to be in conversation.